So welcome, Sasha. We've been really excited and looking forward to this talk. Just to introduce Sasha and her work. So Sasha investigates interdisciplinary, feminist and creative approaches to environmental sensing. She's a lecturer in GeoHumanities at Royal Holloway, University of London, where she teaches at the intersection of geography and the arts and humanities. In her new book, Sensing Art in the Atmosphere, which just recently came out, Sasha draws on 6 years of research experience with artistic and activist communities, where she's been investigating the aesthetics and politics of atmosphere. Together with Sophie Dyer, she leads the feminist amateur radio project Open Weather, which is what we're going to hear a lot more about shortly. So over to you, Sasha. Thank you.
Cool. So thank you everybody for attending the seminar hosted by Lumen Studios about creative and feminist approaches to environmental sensing. Thanks especially to Rebecca, Louise, and Melanie for the kind invitation to be part of the seminar series. I'm really thrilled to be here. My name is Sasha, and my pronouns are she and her. So today I'm going to share a project called Open Weather, which I have been developing with my collaborator and dear friend, Sophie Dyer. So you get a sense of who we are and where we're coming from. Sophie is a designer, researcher, activist, and occasional writer, and she is based in London. And she currently works at Amnesty International's Evidence Lab in the Crisis Response Program. I'm a creative geographer, as Rebecca said, working at the intersections of environmental justice, community activism, and contemporary art. And I do hold a lectureship in the GeoHumanities here in London. Really, I'm in my long-term work with activists and artists, and my new work with Sophie on Open Weather, I'm really investigating alternative ways of perceiving, moving, and imagining air and atmosphere, and the wider environment as well. So I know that this talk is being recorded, but I'm making a transcript of this talk also available on Etherpad if anybody wants to follow along for accessibility reasons, or if you have like Wi-Fi connectivity issues. So I'm going to maybe just quickly email you, Rebecca, this link as well, and then maybe you can drop it in the chat. So in this talk today, I'm going to first introduce Open Weather. Next, I'm going to talk about the collective production of what Sophie and I call the Open Weather Long Nowcast. And then I'm going to zoom in a bit on specific dimensions of the Nowcast, and then say a few words about creative and feminist approaches to environmental sensing. So first, about Open Weather. Open Weather is a collaborative research project that probes the porous boundaries between bodies, atmospheres, and weather systems using amateur radio, open data, and feminist tactics of sensing and seance. And at its heart, Open Weather is really about coming to terms with our bodies as atmospheric entities and porous vessels of air. We breathe, right, and we take in the elements around us, and we in turn affect our elemental commons. When we breathe, we are inhaling the kind of trace toxins and particles that are the result of particular economies and modes of production, right? But we are also breathing affects, emotions, intensities, pressures, and sensations that animate the spaces in which we live and move. In Open Weather, we like to think about the relationships between bodies and atmospheres, relationships that are transcending categories of the material and the immaterial, the physical and the affective. Yet atmospheres are not accidental, right? They are the consequence of larger weather systems and climate systems. So when I walk through my neighborhood in London, or right now, Stuttgart, on an unseasonably hot day, I am breathing an atmosphere that is the direct result of, among other things, 400 years of colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. As the great philosopher Denise Ferreira da Silva writes, the very heat in the air that is driving ever stranger weather is the direct manifestation of the racialized and capitalist expropriation of lands and goods, people and labor over the past few centuries. And I'm not really speaking in metaphors here, right? So as someone like Christina Sharp would argue, racism is not like bad weather, it literally is weather. Or as Sarah Ahmed writes, racism is a word with an atmosphere, right? Or poet Claudia Rankine, one of my favorites, who says that weather is a form of governing that deals out death and names it living. So there are a variety of scholars who are thinking about the kind of complicity between certain histories, certain climate and weather histories, and the kind of human, institutional, and colonial forces that have been such a part of our Earth system over the past 400 years. Now, when we think about the weather and where weather comes from, we realize that the weather then is more than meteorological. In other words, it is more than a condition of the atmosphere in time and place. Rather, weather includes the physical aspect of our experience, as well as the forces, powers, and institutions that have sort of re-engineered the weather on a global scale, right? So open weather's primary motivation is to do work and thinking around these intersections of bodies, atmospheres, and the wider weather systems in which we live and move. But how in open weather specifically and tactically, practically, do we approach these intersections, this kind of conceptual framework I've just thrown at you? So in open weather, we use amateur radio, open data principles, and feminist tactics of sensing and seance. In other words, we use DIY technologies to read the weather differently, to read the weather perhaps in its more than meteorological complexity, to read the weather perhaps in a feminist mode, and to kind of write new stories about weather that stress the power relations that are suspended always in the air around us. What do we mean by reading the weather? So in open weather, it's important to us not just to kind of describe weather conditions in all their complexity, but also to engage with the infrastructures and technologies that produce our weather. So today, as you all likely know, Earth observation satellites provide the raw data for weather forecasts. And we access this data through our phones or our televisions, right? But these satellites are overwhelmingly owned and operated by some of the same powers and nations that were historically responsible for extracting labor, lands, and resources, and thus are most contributing also to the climate crisis. So in open weather, we want to intervene in this weather-making infrastructure. We want to intervene in this technological condition of weather-making. And so to do so, we arrived at two primary insights rather early on in the project. The first one was that some meteorological satellites operated by the US are constantly broadcasting weather data to the ground. And second, that using free or inexpensive radio technology, it is possible to both capture and decode these transmissions. So we decided to use transmissions from US-operated meteorological or weather satellites as the raw material for the Open Weather project, right? As the raw material for our questions about bodies, atmospheres, and weather systems. In other words, we're sort of using transmissions from these weather satellites against their intended purposes in order to come to terms with the sort of what Bruce Sterling calls the heavy weather of the present. Okay, so now I'm going to play a short film while I talk in the next couple minutes. Rebecca, are you able to see the film? Super. How does this work? How do we generate the raw material for open weather? How do we read the weather differently? Sophie and I use specific antennas. We use freely available software and also our bodies, most importantly, to decode the transmissions of National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, satellites. So this is a clip of me decoding a NOAA-19 satellite pass on the 25th of July in Stuttgart, Germany. And here in this short video, I'm using a turnstile antenna pointed in the direction of an orbiting NOAA satellite to capture its unique transmission. The satellite is orbiting above me for about 10 minutes at each pass, and I'm using a free software called Wix2Image that I have used to predict the location and direction of the satellite's travel before the pass, that I know when it's from orbit above me. Now, imagine the satellite, or NOAA-19 in this case, is orbiting over me in an open field in Stuttgart, so I'm kind of tracking it as it's flying for 10 to 11 minutes. The electromagnetic signal captured by my antenna from the satellite travels down a radio frequency cable, this cable you can see coming off the antenna, and that signal meets an object called a dongle. The dongle converts the analog signal passing through the radio cable into a digital signal that can be interpreted by some software on my laptop. So on the recording of this process being played right now, you can see that I'm using two different kinds of software which are open on my screen. On your right-hand side, the SDR software, or SDR Sharp, is showing me or visualizing what the radio spectrum looks and sounds like in my particular location and with my particular antenna, the tensile antenna I mentioned earlier. There are a series of dashed lines and dots moving as if on a waterfall on the right-hand side window. This is the signal of the NOAA-19 satellite, which makes a kind of perturbation on the radio spectrum at 137.9 megahertz. Now on the left, you can see a window with an image of Europe that is slowly becoming an image of Africa, right? And this is a window through the satellite signal decoding software called Wix2Image. While the SDR software on the right allows me to sense the invisible radio spectrum, the software on the left takes a piece of that spectrum and decodes it in real time into an image. Even more precisely, in the video, I am piping the sound of the satellite from the SDR software to Wix2Image, and Wix2Image is decoding the sound into an image of the Earth from space. The decoding process, as I said, happens in real time, and since radio waves travel at the speed of light, I am actually decoding what the satellite is capturing almost at the same instant that the satellite is capturing that piece of info. Okay. Now, now that I've shown you a bit of the technical process, and we can go if you have questions later as well, we need to ask, what do we in open weather achieve from this process? Okay, so what do we get from this process of live decoding satellite images from space? We initially get images like this. This is what raw data looks like. So you can see there are almost two really kind of darkened but faint channels, a left channel and a right channel. So NOAA satellites collect data using an instrument called the Advanced Very High Resolution Radiometer, which has 6 primary sensors. And the sensors transmit data over these two channels, a near infrared channel on the left and a far infrared channel on the right. By combining the two channels and a base map, if you like, Wix to image can produce false color, in this case black and white, images like this. We also get images like this. This is one of my favorites because of the sunlight glinting off the Mediterranean Sea. And like this. These are the kind of images that we're getting from satellites. Now, these images are striking, at least I think so. But we said earlier that open weather is about probing the porous boundaries between bodies, atmospheres, and weather systems in both creative and feminist modes. So in open weather, we really want to complicate what we understand as body, atmosphere, and weather system, because for us, these terms, as I said earlier, are historically situated and fraught with power relations. So how do we move then from this very technical and kind of visual account of receiving and decoding satellite transmissions to the realm of critical creative questioning and also community building, which I will talk about as well briefly. So we're doing that in 3 main ways. We are publishing a series of how-to guides on the community science platform Public Lab in order to enable anyone without any radio or science or engineering experience to decode their own NOAA satellite transmissions. And we think that by democratizing and expanding this practice beyond the very technical radio communities who already know about it, we seek to enable, or we're trying to enable new perspectives on both satellite infrastructure and weather sensing tactics more generally. So we actually published our DIY satellite ground station guide on Public Lab in June 2020. And I mean, me and Sophie had never experienced this before, but like the tweet that we announced it on went a bit viral, meaning it got like retweeted like many hundreds of times, and ham radio blogs reviewed our guide, and it kind of ended up on websites and forums and ham radio community sites that we had no control over, and it really kind of spread very far, which was very surprising to us. We had no idea this would happen. But it also really invited us to reflect on who was interested in this kind of work and what do they think this work is doing. And I can talk more about the reception of the guide because there was it was a bit fraught at times by in certain corners of the ham radio community. But also this guide was the primary way in which we grew the open weather community and network in the summer of 2020, this past summer. So that's one way in which we've been trying to bring certain questions and how we've tried to expand this practice beyond the very kind of technical spheres in which it's already known and practiced. And also how we're trying to ask questions that are feminist and critical creative, as I'll go into later. So secondly, we have been developing a series of performances that bring together artistic ways of working with feminist approaches to also ask questions of our shared weather conditions and the technologies and powers that co-produce those conditions, right? So pictured here is a 30-minute live stream performance called Open Work Second Body, which Sophie and I were commissioned to produce for the Global Sound Arts Festival, Routledge 2020 last May. And in the performance, and also at that time under conditions of quarantine, we live decoded NOAA satellite transmissions from our balconies in northwest and southeast London. And this live decoding process was mixed through sound with field recordings and a spoken word response by the author Daisy Hildyard, who had written the book Second Body. In Open Work Second Body, we're really trying to use both our bodies and our radio environments, our limited radio environments of the balcony, right, as tools to choreograph interference and noise into satellite images. So I want to highlight also in this choreographing of noise into satellite images, we're also, a really key and central part of our practice is to use our bodies as part of the antenna or as part of the sensing apparatus. So really to kind of play with how our bodies produce certain kinds of noise or interference or certain kind of qualities that are inscribed into the image because of its analog nature. And this performance was also kind of thirdly about discontinuous experiences of scale. So the fact that we were operating from our balconies during quarantine, in a very kind of tightly enclosed space, while imaging weather systems, including COVID weather systems, right, far removed from our specific locations in our homes. Another performance that we've developed over the years is called the satellite seance. In the satellite seance, we use archival materials derived from 19th century seances and the records of the mesmerist Franz Anton Mesmer to propose the satellite signal decoding event as a ritual. So in the seance, we create a space in which this ritual of satellite signal decoding can be aligned with the stories of those people who were marginalized from the development of wireless communication and radio technology across history. So we, in many ways, we use this performance as a device to align ourselves with the women who were practicing seances in the 19th century, who were described by some authors as a wireless telegraphic network, right? We also use a series of code words and vocabularies from historical seances to draw attention to the kind of tactics and techniques employed by women to gain enormous power in their time and to convince people that other worlds were both present and accessible. So in open weather, performance and creative practice really offer us immense opportunities to query, unravel, and kind of misread the tools and practices of weather recording and weather making more generally. Now, linked to these performances and the publication of the DIY Satellite Ground Station Guide, we're also seeking in open weather to build new communities around weather sensing and satellite image decoding. So to that end, in early September, we launched the Open Weather Archive, an online repository where anyone can submit images and sounds from their own weather experiments. So by doing this, we're really trying to build a shared resource library of environmental data, as well as a resource library of critical approaches to thinking about environments, atmospheres, and weather systems. Open weather has grown a lot in the past 6 months. So based on the DIY Satellite Ground Station Guide I mentioned earlier, many people in different countries have actually made their own DIY ground stations. People in Buenos Aires, in Mumbai, in Los Angeles, in Seattle, in Germany, in Italy, and various other parts of Europe. So in late summer 2020, this past summer, we really wanted to try to cohere and strengthen this emerging network of kind of amateur, critical, creative, feminist weather decoders. And so for the Our Networks Festival, this was a festival that happened September 8th through 13th. On the occasion of that festival, we activated the Open Weather Network for the first time by inviting collaborators from all over the world to decode a satellite pass of their choice on Sunday, September 6th. And then to submit their materials as well as their field notes and observations and their kind of the things that they noticed when they were doing it to this Open Weather archive that I'm showing you here. Okay, so everyone submitted their materials from decoding a satellite pass from their location with their ground station on Sunday, September 6th. So out of the materials submitted to the archive, we built a composite image of the Earth and its weather systems. And you can see how we made it here. So for the Our Networks Festival, we called this image the Nowcast because we had asked people to spend a moment on their Sundays capturing satellite imagery and sending it to the Open Weather Archive. But you know, we began thinking about this phrase "nowcast," and we realized that it doesn't really capture what we really did with this event and this artwork, this collaborative artwork. Rather, we began using the phrase after the festival, the long nowcast. So now this is called the Open Weather Long Nowcast. So we use the phrase long nowcast, not as a reference to the Long Now Foundation that I'm sure you know about. Rather, we initially named this work a nowcast because we thought it would be a kind of snapshot, like a single point in time. But you know, this co-produced weather image is not really a snapshot. So as I told you earlier, each of the pieces recorded by each individual is actually recorded over a period of 10 to 12 minutes, right? So it's actually a kind of durational image. Each piece has time encoded into it in every line, right? But beyond this, this image is also a kind of fragmented record of the Earth processes, weather systems, and climate systems that have been engineered by the past 400 years of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and colonialism, as I said earlier. So in Open Weather, we consider like the weather, again, to be more than meteorological. So we think that the weather systems captured in this image by 13 unique weather observers around the world, these weather systems are not accidental, right? They are the ephemeral consequence of a very long now. And for us, the long nowcast really speaks to what we want to do with Open Weather. So the nowcast is very much for us a kind of counter image to the smooth and seamless globe that we know as Google Earth, right? Or what the writer Ingrid Burrington very nicely calls forever noon on a cloudless day, right? This is not forever noon on a cloudless day. It's not the smooth and seamless view from above, right? In our view, featuring these multiple patchy and noisy satellite recordings from collaborators around the world really challenges the view from nowhere and instead offers perhaps multiple and entangled views from somewhere. That's not very eloquent, but I think you know what I mean. You know, the Nowcast is also co-created by observers who are very much weathering and experiencing the very conditions they are recording. They are immersed themselves in the weather systems that they are recording with their antennas, right? And the images produced for the Nowcast are grounded in and textured by these local conditions. In the case of the observers who contributed to the Long Nowcast, and of course, since we were in the midst of a very heavy and volatile tropical storm season in 2020, some of them were also weathering many severe storms, right? Including Super Typhoon Haishen approaching mainland China and North Korea. This is an image weather recording produced by Yoshi Matsuoka in Japan, right? And he was really imaging this while weathering the kind of imminent onslaught of Super Typhoon Haishen. Really spectacular and very troubling image. Although it is much harder to detect and to see, the Nowcast also picked up the clouds of smoke emanating from forest fires in the American North and Southwest. So one of our open weather collaborators, Zach Wetstein in Seattle, wrote in the archive about his experience of, I'm quoting, wildfire particulate drifting to Seattle from the Pacific Ocean, originating from forest fires in Oregon and California. Similarly, Joaquin Ezcurra, operating from his ground station in Buenos Aires, Argentina, wrote in the archive, my satellite pass was recorded on an island in Sarmiento River, part of the delta of Parana River, where wetlands have been burning completely in the last months. The full-size nowcast, as well as the archive to which contributors submitted materials, is available, if you like to see it, on our newly launched website, which is open-weather.community. And on the website, you can also zoom in great detail to the nowcast and look at the images and also the sounds and field notes submitted by the contributors. So you can kind of read up on the various notes that people were taking as they were creating these images. Okay, so now comes my zooming out for a moment and thinking about what I can distill from open weather in relation to creative and feminist modes of environmental sensing. So I'm going to just gesture to 2 points, actually, which are not exhaustive, of course, but maybe it will just be a starter for conversation. So for me, a large part of the work of doing creative critical environmental sensing lies in foregrounding our politics of location. So our social, economical, historical, geographical, and political positions. This, of course, is a tactic pioneered by the Black feminists of the Combahee River Collective in the 1950s and 60s, who really analyzed how multiple and intersecting forms of power and privilege really come together in every single person, right? Every single body. So thinking about the politics of location, of course, then involves mapping the networks of power in which we are complicit in order then to fully understand our role in what many scholars call the matrix of domination. So in both open weather and my longer term academic and creative work with artists and activist communities, I'm really finding that careful attention to the politics of location helps enlarge different forms of environmental sensing. So in open weather, for example, Sophie and I do a lot of thinking about our positions as white women from global north countries with jobs and secure housing, and yet bodies who are very often policed and sometimes even trolled online by amateur radio communities because we are entering into these very technical and often very closed spaces, right? So thinking carefully about our positions really informs, for me and Sophie, every decision we make about the technology we're using, the kinds of software we use, what kind of data we're producing, how that data gets disseminated and communicated, the things that we want to, the kind of lenses that we apply on the data, and really the kind of spaces that we want to create in open weather. So the kinds of spaces we create in workshops like the one I'm imaging here. In my longer body of work over the past 15 years on activism and atmosphere, I've also found that addressing the politics of location leads to the need to draft what I'm now calling memos of understanding to enable, for me at this moment, air pollution sensing in underserved communities in Argentina. So in other words, there are tools and protocols I'm finding that can ensure, or not ensure, at least try to make possible the event that those who live in the environments being sensed are the ones who own the data and who benefit from its collection and dissemination, who also kind of have a certain amount of power and control over how that data is both collected and then published, right? So there are a variety of kind of like written documents and protocols I'm finding that are very useful for that. And that really, again, emerges from thinking hard about politics and the politics of location. Now, the second broad point, related to what I've just said, I found that performances and creative practice, these spaces can really become sort of laboratories for doing sort of critical thinking and positioning. So the great feminist Marxist scholar Nikita Davan writes that what she calls feminist survival kits can emerge from what she calls post-colonial queer utopias written and imagined by artists and poets. I'm also a big fan of the work of Joanna Varon and Sasha Costanza-Chock, who produced what's called the Oracle of Trans-Feminist Futures, which is a kind of tarot card deck with different visions of techno-feminist futures and worlds kind of inscribed in this deck that can be kind of played with and then enacted. So in Open Weather, and a little bit in response to this, our performance practice has led us to produce what we call the Open Weather Feminist Toolkit. So we basically came to the realization that in order to navigate the worlds that we are navigating in open weather, we need to treat our feminist principles like they are tools in a toolbox, right? So not that they are additions or superficial veneers, but they are actually tools like the same as our antenna and our dongle and our cables. So the Open Weather Feminist Toolkit is a living document and a kind of, again, a kind of survival kit for us that links our feminist principles to the DIY, hands-on, and creative elements of our work together. The toolkit includes sections on things like, of course, the politics of location, but also on concepts of weathering, on our bodies counting, on open data practices, on alternative histories of seance and sensing. And for us, the toolkit will never really be finished. However, it is going to be actually published in living form, so embedded, along with a series of illustrations in an online research platform on care, ecology, and community, curated by Bianca Stopani and the nonprofit art space in London, Almanac, this fall. So the larger point I guess I'm making here to begin to conclude is, for myself and Sophie, artistic and creative practice has really enabled us to prefigure the kinds of critical and imaginative spaces that we want ourselves to work and dwell in. And this work has then led us to invent our own creative feminist toolkits for doing environmental sensing work and practice. In closing, I want to thank Sophie Dyer for being the best collaborator I have ever had. It's true. I also want to do a feminist shout out to Piper Haywood, who coded and developed the openweather.community website. I also want to congratulate and express gratitude to all of the contributors to the Open Weather Community Long Nowcast on the 6th of September. So these people were Audrey Briot, Sophia Caffery, of course Sophie, whose call sign is M6Nix, Steve Engelmann, Joaquin Escora, Jacques Chanty, Bill Lyles, call sign NQ6Z, L. Paul Verhage, who is KD4STH, Yoshiki Matsuoka, JF1SAG, Ankit Sharma, Jack Wetstein, and Wixfids. And then, of course, I also want to thank once again Lumen Studios, especially Rebecca, Louise, and Melanie for the kind invitation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sasha. That was an amazing talk. Really enlightened. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So yeah, we begin to open it out to questions, and I think we also said we invited people to talk about their own projects or other projects, sensing projects. I know Melanie has a question already, but yes, if you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat or feel free to speak up at the end of Sasha's answer. So Mel, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Sasha, that was an amazing talk. Thank you so much. I really loved the part where you were talking about the body as a sensor, and it got me thinking about Karen Barad's theory of agential realism. I think you, I was wondering what you thought about that, and if you were interested in that theory.
Yeah, Melanie, I've actually, I've written an article with Joel, who I think you know, precisely on Karen Barad's theory of interaction, and how that can specifically inform and, let's say, counter some of the dominant Earth narratives that we're hearing kind of around today, especially the Anthropocene and the technosphere. So I wouldn't say I'm like a deep scholar of Karen Barad's work, but I've definitely engaged with her a lot. I've actually also met her a few times, which has been lovely. Yeah, so Karen Barad, in terms of like agential realism and interaction, of course, you know, there's really a lot to say. So Karen Barad is really coming from quantum physics and queer theory and feminist theory as well, right? And she's kind of showing how even at the quantum level, things are not distinct. Things are not like separated out into their little boxes and entities and elements, right? So she has this amazing article about the electron and how early physicists were kind of horrified when they discovered that the electron could actually engage in what they called self-touching, so like touching itself, curling back on itself, meaning that the electron did not operate in one way and it was not pinpointed to one thing. It had this like duality and wave-like quality, which was kind of like, in their eyes, queer, and they were horrified by that quality. And of course, Karen Pratt then recuperates this and brings it into one of her central stories. And I think in terms of, yeah, I'd have to think, Melanie, about specifically Karen Barad's ideas and open weather. I mean, certainly I think for both myself and Sophie, the sensing process, the satellite sensing process is interactive. I think it's fair for me to say. Sophie may disagree eventually, but I think it's interactive in the sense that we do not see this process as being a kind of linear, one thing, causational, one thing leads to another sort of thing. It's really a kind of like interplay, a reaction and a response, a constant choreography and a constant repositioning of our bodies in the electromagnetic field. We're simultaneously, of course, sensing the signal sent by the satellite, but of course the other elements of our radio environments that we are becoming sensible to through the technologies that we're using. So there's, I mean, I wouldn't say that Sophie and I are sensing at the quantum level. That would maybe be going too far, but I think we're really like sensing in a way that does not allow us to separate out the elements of the sensing apparatus as unique elements. It's really all part of, I mean, from the satellite body to the signal, to our bodies, to the antenna, to the computer, to the cable, to the software, everything is interacting. Everything is queering and touching each other and feeding back into each other. And that's really the kind of experience it is, which is also why, you know, when we do workshops, we love workshops, because workshops, I mean, like the kind of joy, like the joyousness that we experience when we do this, other people get it too. It's not just us. So like there's really a kind of exuberance that comes with this really felt and embodied experience that we are really immersed in and centering in our work. So yeah, Mel, I think I would love to speak to you more about Karen Barad.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of like the the idea of a piece of apparatus, and there's a piece in her text which specifically talks about the apparatus. So yeah, it would be great to talk more about that.
Yeah, no, I just love her. I love her. I love her work. Huge fan. And yeah, I think her story and her figure has done so much. I mean, teaching as she does and as she has for decades, queer and feminist approaches to physics in physics departments is a gigantic feat. And when I met her, she talked about that kind of work that she does, and I just have so much respect for the kind of change that she's been making.
Okay. I think Harry Meadows was asking what the software was called. I think when you were describing your work, if you could let us know about that.
Yeah, Harry. So yes. So there are several pieces of software which I can tell you right now. I will say that everything is very carefully documented and spelled out on the Open Weather Public Lab Wiki. So this is the, I'll see if I can put it in the chat. This is the Public Lab site that I mentioned, where we are really providing how-to guides and documented kind of manuals for the kind of technical practices that we're engaged in. Now, while I put that in the chat, the software that I showed, there was a radio or SDR software called SDR Sharp, so SDR like hash at the end. And that is, again, a software that allows you to, using an antenna of your choice, to see and sense the radio spectrum from your particular location. This software is amazing. There are many other softwares that allow you to do this, such as Cubic SDR, such as GQRX, such as HDSDR. I mean, the list goes on. There's a lot out there. And I think the main amazingness of this kind of software, so I would put all those things I just named into one kind of umbrella SDR software, is that it allows you to engage with the radio spectrum without buying a 1,000-pound transceiver and without buying the technical equipment that every ham radio operator normally has to buy, right? So because of innovations in digital technology, we can, for completely free, download software, get an antenna or make an antenna by ourselves, get some cheap cables, and be able to access the radio spectrum. And that's one of the reasons that Sophie and I got really interested in this particular kind of radio sensing and satellite signal decoding. I've just put the Public Lab Open Weather Wiki in the chat. The other software that I showed you was called Wix to Image, and that's a bit different. So Wix to Image literally takes a piece of sound coming from the radio software and interprets that sound into an image. So when I was playing the video, I think you probably heard this like TikTok-y, like lyrical sound. That is the image. So the sound is the image. That is the image that the satellite is sending through the radio spectrum, decoded into sound, and then decoded by Wix to Image. Wix to Image, unfortunately, unlike the other SDR softwares I mentioned earlier, Wix to Image is a closed source and proprietary software, meaning it is dead. It's last updated in 2018. Many of us have knocked on the door of the last updater and asked why, but that's simply how it is. And so basically me and Sophie, one of our kind of secret like main projects actually is creating or helping to create with some open source coders an open source version of Wix to Image, which would be open source, free to download, and which would do all the same things. So we're actually in conversations with a programmer who made an amazing open source version of Wix to Image called NOAA APT, and I'm currently applying for some funding sources to see if we can get him some support to make it have all the features as Wix to Image. I can talk about software for a long time, Harriet. I hope that's okay for now.
That's great, very thorough. I'm really looking forward to checking it all out. We've got a question or a comment and a question from Lucy Helton. I'll just read it out, unless you want to ask it, Lucy, if you're there. Oh, I'll read it out. Lucy says, oh, hi.
Figure out how to unmute my audio.
No worries.
Hi, Sasha. What I wrote in the chat, and I can just repeat, is that I'm an artist and I gained a ham radio general class license in order to transmit my images to other hams worldwide. It took me months, I think about 8 months, and there's less than 100,000 women, in the US that have this license, especially under the age of 60. Anyway, I've had trouble finding hams and contacting other hams when I'm making transmissions. And you mentioned that you tweeted. And so I was wondering, do you have a big following on Twitter? Because it sounds like you found a lot of people to receive or to build their own ground stations anyway.
Yeah, Lucy. Yeah, so I tweeted what I thought was a completely normal tweet on like the end of June, kind of announcing the DIY satellite ground station guide in public lab, and just saying like, hey, everybody out there, here's the guide that Sophie and I wrote. It's public, it's online, and yeah, I really got, I think in the space of 2 days, like 300 more followers. I wouldn't say I have a huge following on Twitter. I think I have a little over 2,000 followers. I wouldn't say most of those are ham radio people, but like I got a lot more because of that tweet. And I think it was because AMSAT UK, like AMSAT France, several other kind of like ham radio blogs, like ham radio community blogs and forums, retweeted, shared, reviewed the guide, and then retweeted my tweet with their comments on the guide. So basically, it kind of spread through probably word of mouth, and people on Twitter who are hams reading each other's tweets. So I can't say more than that, really. I was very surprised that it got that much attention.
Okay, thanks. I'll try Twitter next time.
Yeah, but nice to know that you're another ham radio operator.
Yes, I basically, the license is all memory. So, I took a training course too, but I just memorized all the questions and answers. So I wouldn't say I'm really a ham radio operator, but I do have a transceiver and I do make my own transmissions. So
that's fantastic. Yeah, I don't have a transceiver. I rely completely on software and DIY materials. So yeah, that's really fantastic. What's your call sign?
Oh God, I knew you were going to ask me that. KD2 MFV, I think.
I'm Mike 6 India Oscar Romeo.
Is it okay to email you? Because obviously I don't want to take up so much of everybody else's time, but that would be okay to email you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
okay.
Great.
All right, thank you.
So I think while we're waiting for any other questions that are coming in, I think Louise has prompted me to a comment made by Santino earlier on, and Santino said, "Body as antenna, amazing." I enjoyed seeing that pop up.
Yeah, and like just to riff on that a bit, Santino. So in the performance I mentioned called Open Work Second Body, so that's when Sophie and I were standing on our balconies in Northwest, Southeast London, and both of us live in buildings. I live in like a 5 or 6 story building, so he lives in a kind of terraced building. Anyway, both of us were really kind of also feeling how our bodies in relation to our balconies and the building around us like had different influences on the images that we were decoding. And Sophie actually noticed that when she stood barefoot on her metal balcony in Northwest London, she received a better image, a longer and clearer image than when she was not barefoot. So of course, this is really about how our bodies are, of course, receivers and transmitters, and how electromagnetic signals, of course, pass through our bodies into the other materials around us. And I didn't have as much luck. I have a gigantic metal overhang, and my balcony was not as conducive to me being barefoot. but we always tell that story because it just really kind of manifests the kinds of thinking that we're also doing, and also the fact that, as I'm sure Lucy will know, a ham radio operator would never decode a satellite from their balcony. That's like the worst place to do that. You know, you're like in the middle of the city, surrounded by noise, surrounded like right next to a building, like totally horrible place to decode an image from space. So we were really we were actually forced in lockdown, in quarantine, to do something with our bodies that we wouldn't have done otherwise. Santino says, also the idea of injecting noise into the image, really great stuff. Thanks, Santino. Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that was going to be a question I was going to ask you actually, Sasha, about how, because I know you've been developing the project with Sophie for a while, and how the lockdown interfered with that development, but also, I guess, gave you a different opportunity, a different way to develop it. And I know you recently came off. Are you still in Germany? Are you back? Okay. So yeah, if you wanted, could you tell us a little bit more about?
Yeah, sure.
The experiment there.
Yeah, well, so in terms of like the lockdown in mind, Sophie's collaboration, yeah, we had actually, before the lockdown in London and the COVID-19 crisis, we had planned for both of us to come to an artistic residency that I'm currently on here in Stuttgart in Germany. And we had planned to spend pretty much the whole month of April doing open weather, collaborating together here. It would have been really nice. Then of course that didn't happen, and we were forced to like rethink that residency time. Of course, we couldn't travel to Germany, but both of us had still kind of allocated the month of April for our time together. So we actually evolved a remote way of working, which involved signing on to Jitsi every morning at 10, making a plan for the day, decoding a satellite pass maybe at like 11:30, having another meeting around lunchtime, like doing some practical stuff in the afternoon, and maybe like decoding a second pass in the evening. So every day we were kind of basically online together and decoding satellite passes simultaneously but remotely. So the same satellite, but remotely from each other. And I really think, first of all, for both of us, it completely saved our mental health in that time. I mean, that was just having that rhythm and that ritual and like having each other and having that kind of purpose was completely necessary for us in a well-being sense. But also I really realized the kind of power of present remoteness. So doing things in sync or simultaneously that you wouldn't normally do otherwise, but then that kind of like repetitive doing and like that repeated kind of doing things at the same time, then for us really provided the ground for conversations and sharing stuff and moving the project onward. So yes, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it did reformat our ways of working. And then the kind of nice end of that story is that because travel restrictions were lifted over the summer, Sophie was able to come to Stuttgart to spend time with me here in September. And we had 2 weeks of kind of lovely time together and did a workshop together. And it was very fulfilling.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Harry also commented on when you were talking about being trolled by other members of the ham radio community. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about that experience, if you want to talk about being trolled?
Sure. So I mentioned also in response to Lucy how the tweet about the satellite ground station guide, basically our guide made it into forums and places on the web and internet spaces that we didn't really predict. So one of those was the most famous blog for software-defined radio or SDR radio activities. And this, so our guide basically ended up on this blog, and it was framed as we framed it. So we said this is or rather, Open Weather is a creative and feminist project. And then our guide was posted, and basically then in the comments section were things like, intersectional feminist ethos barf? Or who are these people? Tell them to get the hell out of our hobby. Their bogus political agenda is stinking up everything it touches. Like, I'm just paraphrasing, something like that. So like, I won't go on, but there were these kinds of like comments that were pretty like unfriendly and inflammatory and derogatory and kind of like negatively characterizing our work. I have to say there were also people that then in the forums replied to those kind of trolling comments to correct what those people had said. But then weirdly, so one of the replies was like, to the comment I just said was like, oh, maybe you're the problem for our ham radio community. All I see is a couple of YLs trying to get more YLs into radio. So in radio speak, YL means young lady, and YL is an acronym applied to all women, all feminine presenting individuals. So, so all women are kind of lumped into, or feminine presenting individuals are lumped into the term YL. And it's, I certainly believe, and people that I've talked to believe, that it's diminishing and also derogatory and just like kind of making women in radio out to be a bit like cute. So even though we were kind of defended by some people, then these acronyms were used that both Sophie and I find very problematic, although we thanked and were grateful that there were some people kind of getting on the case of the trollers in the comments. So that's the story. That's one of the stories, Harry.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm sorry if it was it's a traumatic question, but it was interesting to hear that the apparatus is owned by certain people who don't want to share it, which maybe is the case with technology more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Yeah, I think there's definitely a sense of ownership and of possession and policing of boundaries there. I mean, I should also say, in counter to my stories of trolling, that Sophie and I actually do collaborate with many ham radio operators. So one of them is, of course, Bill Lyles, NQ6Z, who has been one of the like kind of most amazing there for us. Will read our guides before they're published, will vet our ideas, basically is just a total dream collaborator and is in the Open Weather Network. So this is by no means the only experience of ham radio. There are definitely like amazing people who have helped Sophie and I a lot in our journey to this place. It was just that a few of our experiences over the summer reflected differently. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Thanks, Harry.
I think, thank you, Harry. George Ridgway has a question. George, would you like to ask it? Or do you want me to?
Hi. Yeah, I can kind of read and elaborate. I was just wondering, thanks also for a really interesting talk. And I managed to see the performance that you collaborated with Daisy. I thought that was great. I was just wondering whether you've ever encountered like either interception from different species, or whether this would even be applicable in the way that you're doing it. It's just, I've been reading recently about the role of DIY weather monitoring as a means to kind of map migration flows of insects and birds and bats. But they might be using more radar-based stuff. I'm not quite sure with the tech, but I just wondered if you had come into contact with that.
Yeah, thanks, George. That's so interesting. Actually, in my other work with artists and activists, in which I'm mainly working with people who make launch and fly solar-powered balloon-like sculptures to kind of query different ways of moving, sensing, and engaging in the atmosphere, and basically are using radio, but also radar, and like thinking about the threshold of perception between these balloon-like objects and swarms of insects and other kinds of species. So I know from that work, for instance, that so to give some context, the activists I work with, they're launching these 40 to 4,000 square cubic meter balloons, but the balloons are only filled with hot air warmed by the sun. And so the whole idea is that one can fly only by trapping energy in a very absorbent membrane. So kind of like what's behind me. This is actually from that project. So one can fly by trapping energy in a very absorbent membrane. That means by simply kind of harnessing the energy already circulating in the air without using helium or hydrogen or kind of burning hydrocarbons to get off the ground. And that this technology of flying is actually very useful. And so with my activists, we launch sculptures from Berlin, and they travel all the way to Poland quite regularly, and they travel much higher than passenger planes. They reach the edge of the stratosphere. So in this kind of work, we're often thinking about solar-powered fuel-free flight. Now, one of the key questions of doing this kind of work is that in order to enter the atmosphere with a large object, i.e. a 4,000 or maybe less square meter balloon, you need to get permission from air traffic control, right, from the kind of legal institutions that are governing the air. So one needs to do a kind of whole series of forms and documentations and legal frameworks in order to have the permission to launch something like that. So now when we get the permission and when we launch, one big question to us was, well, okay, so we're getting permission, but could air traffic control radar systems actually see an aeroscene sculpture, this like solar-powered balloon-like sculpture? So I did some research. This is actually, I wrote about in my book, which is here. So I did some research on this. And basically what I've concluded is that air traffic control uses two primary radar systems. One is so primary radar works by a kind of bounce off of an object or a entity or a flying thing. Secondary radar works when a central radar system is bouncing or kind of getting a ping off a device called a transponder, which is a mandatory device to have on board a passenger plane, for instance. Now, you don't need to have a transponder on an aeroscene balloon like that. So we're only interested in whether air traffic control can sense aeroscene sculptures with primary radar. So what then I discovered is that, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get to your question in a moment. What then I discovered was that within radar systems, they don't want to see everything. They want to actually weed out things that could cloud the radar or could obscure the important things. So there are particular tools and algorithms that are used to weed out the presence of birds, of clouds, of like things that are very low to earth surface, swarms of insects, things like that. So I think it's called a moving target indicator is the particular technology used to weed these things out. So I concluded that actually an aeroscene balloon traveling along with the wind is no more sensible than a cloud because it's just a bunch of hot air traveling with the wind. It's, in my opinion, given what I've researched, no more sensible by radar than a moving warm air mass would be. So back to your question about whether whether species like swarms of insects or other things can interfere or be sensible in the weather sensing stuff that I do, the granularity of detection of satellites is even more rough, is even less than primary radar. So one pixel in the satellite maps that I was showing you earlier is about 4 kilometers in diameter, okay? So with no satellites, you're not going to see much trace unless it was, I mean, a complete like gigantic locust swarm, which I imagine have happened. I don't think it would come up. However, Sophie and I are working on not hacking, but decoding transmissions from satellites that are more precise than NOAA satellites. So in the future, we may be able to be more precise with our decoding sessions. That was a very long tangential answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That was a really great answer. Just quickly to follow off of that, is there anywhere, I guess in your book, but where you talk, or that I could find more about the balloons and
Yeah, I've written this book. I've also written several articles. To be very honest, everybody on this talk, I'm very happy to provide personal copies of the personal PDF of this book. I shouldn't be saying that, my publisher only, but I think this should be shared, and I wrote it for a general audience, not for the 5 people that are in my field in the academic world. So yeah, I would be happy if you write me a personal email to send you a copy for personal use. But also, I've written like articles and journals about several different dimensions of this artist activist work around solar balloon-like objects and the kinds of questions that it also raises. So yeah, just get in touch with me over email. I can send you PDFs.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, George. Hi, Toby. Sorry, I've just seen Toby's message in the chat. I would love to see your new puppy at some point.
I think I did see it earlier. Oh, there we go. Oh,
dinosaur.
Oh my gosh, Toby.
Okay, bye.
What a darling.
Oh. Dinosaur, back. No, he doesn't. He's not going to. Okay, now.
That's so cute. Thank you, Toby. The nice interlude.
Yeah, so
Andrew, you have a question. Andrew, where are you? Oh.
Hi, I'm here.
Oh, hello.
Hi. Yeah, is that you can see the International Space Station from the Earth at certain times when the sun is glinting off it. Can you ever actually see the NOAA satellite that you're referring to?
Yeah, you can, Andrew. And there's a website called N2YO where you can get predictions for satellite orbits, but very helpfully, if you go to n2yo.com and you search for like NOAA 19, for instance, it will give you a kind of table of all the upcoming passes over the next 10 days. It will also hide in the table which passes are visible to the naked eye. So these are generally passes either at dusk or as night is falling, and yes, you can see the satellites.
I'm imagining all these people standing around with antennas pointing at some invisible thing in the sky. It's quite a performative act when it's happening.
Yeah, and that's part of it. I mean, like, because Sophie and I have done this, I don't know how many hundreds of times. Like, we're so used to the length of a NOAA orbit, so we're almost like it's kind of embedded in our muscle memory and our kind of bones, like how fast we have to move the antenna to track the satellite. Also, of course, every satellite pass, you need to know not only whether it's orbiting from north to south or south to north, but you also have to know at what degree will it be at its maximum elevation. So at the midpoint of the pass, at what elevation will the satellite be over you? So often it's like a 60 degree elevation, in which case you need to point your antenna at 60 degrees out of 90 when the pass is at the midpoint. So there are really a lot of ways in which Sophie and I have kind of through repetition, like attuned to the speeds that these machines are flying. but also we use software to tell us these elevations and other key info. Yeah.
Have you ever, have strangers come across you doing this in the middle of a sports field or wherever, or come up to you and said, what the heck is going on? And this looks like some sort of religious performance or whatever.
Andrew, and this is where the I wouldn't say trolling, but the other comments come in. I used to go almost every single day into Burgess Park in Southeast London back in summer 2019. People would yell at me, what's the Wi-Fi code? Or like, dudes would come to me and say, it would be better if you stood by a tree because the tree would give you better reception, or like something that doesn't even make sense, right? Or like I would get all kinds of basically unsolicited advice from men. I never had a chance, never had that with women. I also got many, people kind of giving you the side eye, not sure what you're doing. One group of students was like, hey, are you from Stranger Things? Like, have you just like stepped out of the show, Stranger Things? So yeah, it's like I have a whole like catalog of these encounters, and one day maybe I'll do something with them.
And do the strangers, when you explain what the work is about, does that engage them in a different way? Obviously it would, but do they really engage in the whole idea of what you're doing?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because all kidding aside, I do think that if and when people have asked questions about what I'm doing, often it's a very beautiful experience. I mean, like, whether it's kids or parents and kids or other people, the kind of questions have led to conversations I wouldn't have had otherwise. I've met people in my neighborhood I would never have met. I met a woman radio amateur from Oman who lives around the corner from me, who I never would have met because she saw me with my antenna in the park and came over to say hi. So I think, and for those who've asked questions and have not been coming from a radio background, it's often led to really interesting talks. So yeah, so I think like the kind of degree to which those talks carry onward is always, it doesn't really kind of move beyond the park, usually.
Okay. I'm involved in the aeroscene movement to some extent.
I know
we built a Museo Aerosolar here in Australia about 2 years ago. And I was in Munich last year for the festival as well for a day, playing with the sculptures, and people coming up to you while you're playing with the big black balloons in the sky and wondering what's going on. And yes, there's this big two-way engagement, but that's a much different performative act than just an antenna, so it has a different engagement.
Yeah, no, Andrew, I actually the anecdote about what happened to your Museo Aerosolar sculpture is in my book.
Is it really?
Yeah. It's in a footnote, but it's there. Yeah, it's a much renowned event of launching a museo, and
is it really? Okay.
Yeah, no, it's really and I really appreciated the forum post you wrote on the Aeroscene forum. So
all right. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to talk to you some time about how your work connects to my work as well. I'm researching breath, how breath as an individual act connects us with the atmosphere and all the global processes. So I'll catch up with you at some point in the future.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's have a separate conversation.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. Maria has a question and a comment. Maria, are you still there? Around to ask it. So Maria has said, thank you for the offer of the PDF book. And she'd love to read more around your feelings about global warming and the evidence we gain versus theories. And then she goes on to say, have you formed your own opinions on alternative reasons for climate change versus what humans have affected?
So I'm okay, let me read that again. Have you formed your own opinions on alternative reasons for climate change versus what humans have affected? Maria, I am not understanding that completely. I mean, in my research and my opinions, I am very confident that humans have created climate change and are the main drivers of climate change. So yeah, I think, you know, but I think what I could then riff on that is that through open weather, both Sophie and I often think about how the practice of satellite signal decoding and weather sensing, often between scales. So as I said, we are physically located on the ground. We're sensing the local weather conditions, but we're also imaging weather on scales far removed and far greater than we can ever personally experience. So we've often used that kind of scale discontinuity, or like a scale entanglement, as a way to think about climate change, as a way to think about how we can maybe feel a bit more responsible, or a bit more like we are affecting the rate and pace of climate change. One of mine, Sophie's kind of dream projects actually is to create an open weather kit for primary schools. So we want to create like antennas with like fuzzy handles, and like everything would be like a pink or like a neon yellow or like a neon green color, and there would be like little fuzzy bobs on the antenna and stuff. And we want to basically create like kind of like a fun open weather sensing kit for children, because we think that this practice can be done by children. Like you really could do it with primary school kids. And as a device for educating around climate change and really making connections between the local and the planetary, or the local and the kind of translocal, we think that this practice is a very interesting tool. So watch this space, look out for the fuzzy handled antennas and the...
That would be amazing.
Yeah, it's really like maybe number one on our list, actually, of dream projects. So
I'd love to see that happen. I can got a visual of it. It's a wonderful idea. Harry also said it's a great idea. I was going to ask, like, what's the next steps for the project? I mean, you're still obviously in Germany, and like, sort of, are you carrying on with different stages, or do you have any other mass experiments planned? Or?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. It's like, yeah, it's a bit, so we've had this really, really nourishing and fulfilling summer where we really moved the project onward quite a lot, and that was made possible by the residency and by Sophie being able to come here and us being able to spend time together. So basically, we've left a few things on the burner that are kind of playing themselves out. So one of these is the publishing of the feminist toolkit via Almanac Gallery. One of these is that I'm submitting a grant proposal through my university to basically get funding to spend much more of my daily life on open weather than I do now. Sophie also, so basically I think I should also say that both of us are always negotiating our professional lives and how we do open weather in relation to our like everyday work, because both of us work full-time jobs. Sophie, working at Amnesty, is also going to hopefully have more time to maybe even one day a week for open weather in 2021. But at the moment, I guess on the horizon is also a few sound works that we're working on. There's one for like a Greek radio station that we're going to be producing for early 2021. There is, another big element is that we're still kind of augmenting the website. So we're looking to basically add what is currently missing to the website, which is basically the information about our artistic practice. So right now the website has the archive, the public lab, the nowcast, the long nowcast, and a kind of short about text, but we really want it to be a central node for the project where it also hosts our performance practice, and that's currently missing. So we're just working on getting all of those pieces filled in. I'm sure I'm like forgetting like 10 things, but basically there's kind of like little things kind of now playing themselves out, Rebecca.
Yeah, I had one other question. I think Louise just mentioned that Jane wants to ask if you feel excited or depressed seeing Starlink, Elon Musk satellite chains overhead.
Oh, I feel completely depressed. Sorry, who asked that question?
It was Jane.
Jane, yeah, Jane. I feel horrified. I feel depressed. I feel it's an intrusion. It's illegal. It should not be happening. I mean, there are thousands of Starlink satellites due to be launched until 2050, I believe. And the whole idea of creating a kind of Starlink satellite shell or envelope around the Earth to enable some kind of Wi-Fi or data infrastructure is completely misplaced and asymmetric. And I don't think anybody has any questions about Elon Musk's intentions there. I mean, given that he's also just done tests on Neuralinks, where chips in pigs' brains can sense when they've been eating or sleeping or moving, so and of course we also know all of the urgent cries from astronomers saying that they cannot do astronomy when Starlink satellites are passing through a kind of field of vision or producing light pollution. So I'm very worried about Starlink. I'm very worried about generally geospatial imaging and Earth observation imaging at large. I mean, Sophie knows a lot more about this given her work on high resolution satellite images and how they are used to fuel certain kinds of violence in different parts of the world. So, Sophie and I are in a very small way really trying to subvert, ask critical questions, and challenge a really vast infrastructure that goes way beyond weather, right? And sometimes we feel defeated, but I think other times we feel like this is the only way that we know how to engage with this defeating and despairing set of conditions.
Yeah, I know an ecological light pollution researcher that I've been in touch with in the last year or so. He described Starlink as a crime against humanity, and I think a few people have echoed that. It does feel like that. I think it's and I think his tweet was actually featured in the Daily Mail, which he found quite funny. But yeah, that actually leads into another question I had, and I know I'd read about it on Sophie's website, and I think somewhere else in your work about the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research book, and when I read about it, I looked it up, and it's amazing. And I can see like how that would be a fantastic guide for work. I can put a link to it, or if you wanted to send a link. But did you want to talk a little bit about how that's guided the project or helped you sort of structure it?
Yeah, I'm just going to in the chat right now because it's so worth everybody checking out. So yeah, basically the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research, led by Max Liboiron in Newfoundland, Canada, is a feminist, anti-colonial, citizen science-based lab monitoring plastic pollution and other kind of toxic incursions in the waters of Newfoundland. And I mean, there are many reasons why Sophie and I are inspired by this project, but I mean, one of the very key reasons is because Max and her team are really doing science with an explicitly anti-colonial and feminist lens. What that means is that they look at every step in the process of science, so from the generating of research questions to the making of instruments, to the going out and measuring something, to the producing of data, to the verifying of data, to the publication, and they ask at every single micro step, like, what would a feminist or an anti-colonial lens bring in here? So one of the things they do, for example, is they vet their research questions with Indigenous communities in the landscapes in which they're measuring toxins before they even do the measuring or the science itself. So they're always basically working, yeah, I love Max too, Toby. They're basically always working with questions that have been developed by the very communities who are most affected by this kind of pollution. Another thing is that they don't use the kind of like institutional, big science vetted instruments to do the kind of monitoring work that they do. So they actually developed a low cost plastic pollution trawler called the Lady Trawl, which is made almost completely out of everyday materials from hardware stores, and costs like a fraction, like $300, something like that. Whereas the kind of industry standard trawler costs like $30,000. So they always ask like how they can innovate in the kind of DIY side of things. And then another, I could just go on for ages. Their lab book also is a really amazing document. It's also a living document, which really like unpicks at every level of the lab, of decision making, of practice, how they do things. So one of the things talked about in the lab book is how they do this thing called, so when they're publishing data and articles, they look at equity and author order, or author order. It's about, I'm kind of fumbling now. It's basically about looking at who has contributed to an article, who has done the research, who has written the article, who has edited the article, but then also taking into account location and positionality and background, and thinking about what order authors should be in. So not necessarily defaulting to the kind of white man scientist being number one author, or the person who did most of the writing necessarily being the first author. So they might think about who needs an article publication to move on in their life, to get into grad school, to get their first job, and they might then move that person up in the author order of the article publication. So anyway, I could really go on, but I think what Sophie and I really took from CLEAR is also being very explicit about how you work, even down to like the minutest detail, like down to like, you know, how do you start a meeting? What do you do at the beginning of a meeting? Do you have a pronoun check at every meeting? How do you, who chairs that meeting? Because it matters who chairs these kinds of events, right? So I think for Sophie and I, it really invited us to think about open weather in that way, and to really kind of take a microscope into our practices and look at how we do every small thing. And it's basically what inspired also the feminist toolkit that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, Rebecca, I could talk at length about that.
No, it's great. I've had a really good look through it, and I particularly like the ice cream scoop for to use to scoop out catching plastics and other material, and I like how they lay out how to make it. It's really straightforward, really simple, but yeah, everyone should have a look at that. Toby's mentioned baby limbs. Yeah, it's really, really good, and it's really, the language is really sort of easy to read, so yeah, it's really great. Do we have any more comments? Oh, let me have a look. Toby said subverting the idea of the expert. Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's all of the questions. If anyone has anything they wanted to add, please say so now. It's a fantastic talk and conversation. I feel like we could go on for a long time.
Yeah, no, I really having such a great time, and it's been wonderful to be invited and to see some people and talk about these sorts of questions. So yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. I'm just replying to Shanali. The researcher I mentioned is Travis Blanco. He's based at UCLA, and is kind of like a wrote what I think a lot of people think of as the source text in ecological light pollution with another author who I should remember the name of. But yeah, and he's very approachable. If he'll probably tell me off for saying it if anyone wants to email him directly. Yeah, he's really, really wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, Sasha. We'll save the chat and share the links with everybody. And then you also put the link to the transcript, right? So I can share that somewhere. Oh.
Yeah, do you want me to share or do you have it? I can put it.
Oh, I've got it here.
Okay.
I'm just moving it up in the chat. That's great. It's really handy. I like that.
Yeah, I find also because I teach a lot, and Wi-Fi can drop at any moment, so I find that students also appreciate this.
Yeah. That's great. Okay, thanks so much, Sasha. Thank you everyone for all the questions and comments. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, good luck with the rest of the project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens next, Sasha.
Thank you so much for having me.